Okay, welcome back to the HSE Network podcast, guys. Today we're joined by Dan Collins, who is a real expert in sort of sleep. And today we're going to be talking about how that fits into health and safety and sort of the well-being aspects around. And so, Dan, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Okay, so I guess, Dan, my first question to you is, obviously, it's an area of interest, you say sleep. So what really got you interested into sleep and sort of how it helps physical and maybe mental well-being?
Well, it started, I think, way back. I saw a Horizon documentary on BBC about sleep. This was probably 20 or 30 years ago. And it was a reasonably short documentary, but I was quite interested in what they were saying. And at the time, this was long before iPlayer and even being able to record things. But they did send me a transcript. If you apply to BBC, they'd send you a transcript of the show. I remember getting that and reading through it, and it was very interesting. But it was quite brief because 20 years ago, very little was known about sleep. And then, fast forward to about 3 or 4 years ago, I wasn't sleeping so well myself. I think we all have time that we have a sleepless night because we're anxious about something or we're a bit uptight. But I found that night after night, I was waking up about 1 or 2 in the morning and finding it hard to get back to sleep. And so I couldn't find the Horizon transcript, but I started researching it again, and it turned out a number of books had been written. And science had really moved on because of something called the fMRI scanning, where we can look at the brain while people are asleep and actually see what's happening in the brain. It meant that really for the first time, scientists could see what's happening when we sleep and why are we sleeping. And I found this fascinating from a scientific point of view, not that I'm a scientist, but I was interested in this. But also from a personal point of view, I thought, well, if I can understand what's happening when I'm asleep and why I'm waking up in the night, perhaps I can adapt my behaviours so that I sleep better. In learning about it, I managed to improve my own sleep. It's not perfect. I have good nights and bad nights, as we all do, but it's much better. And then thought, well, there's whilst a lot of this stuff is very scientific, is there a way we can communicate it in a half an hour or so talk with people, and then they can apply it to themselves? Because we spend a third of our lives asleep. So if a third of our life is not healthy, then that's going to have an impact on our performance. And that's where my day job gets involved, is I'm interested in helping the people in businesses perform at their best. And so sleep has to be a part of that.
Absolutely. And I think just to echo it, sort of the stuff we talk about on the HSE Network and the stuff we learn from health and safety conferences, people say that there is a case that in health and safety, it's a case of shouting safety, as they call it, and sort of whispering health. It's, what is nice about process, risk assessments, all of that sort of stuff. And whilst that is important, the health of the individual in the end is also incredibly important. I think sleep obviously links into that in so many different ways, doesn't it? If you have good sleep, it impacts on your mental health, your physical health, your performance in the job. Could you give us maybe a bit more of an insight into what the dangers and negative effects of sleep deprivation might be, and on sort of poor quality sleep in the workplace?
Yeah, there are a few headlines that will be familiar. So massive disasters like Exxon Valdez oil spill, the Chernobyl nuclear plant, and the Challenger space shuttle. The investigations that followed those found that fatigue was a significant contributing factor. So when things go badly wrong and we take the trouble to research why, often fatigue has a place apart. The Croydon rail crash more recently, where the guy rolled a tram at going too fast into a bend, is thought to be sleep related as well. But that gets a lot of publicity because there's massive damage in the US, where they investigate the causes of car accidents, and fatigue is one of the things that can be identified. Over 20% of car accidents are down to fatigue. In the UK and Europe, we don't look at it in that way, so we don't really consider whether fatigue is part of it. We look at things like drugs and alcohol. But the microsleep, where we fall asleep momentarily, if that's a second or 2 seconds at 70 miles down a motorway, that's enough for us to change lane. And if you're driving a 30-ton truck at that point, that could well cause problems. And I should imagine most of us, if we've driven on motorways, have had that moment where you see a big truck moving across from the lane to the left, and you think, hang on, why is that happening? And it's more than likely that that could be down to a microsleep. More often than not, they don't lead to catastrophes because they're quite short, but the fact somebody's completely asleep, albeit for a very short period of time, is enough to result in a crisis. So I think a good way to look at it, though, is to compare it to alcohol. Right? So some studies were done in Australia where they took some people who were sober and put them in a driving simulator. They put some people who were over the alcohol limit and put them in a driving simulator. And they put some people who had been awake for 19 hours in the same driving simulator. And they found that the impairment was the same for people who had been awake for 19 hours as it was for the people who were over the alcohol limit. So not getting out of sleep is as serious as using alcohol in the workplace. And we wouldn't dream nowadays of allowing people to use alcohol at work, and nor should we really be encouraging poor sleep. And I think we'd think, well, we would never encourage people to sleep badly. But in actual fact, if we're asking somebody to get on a flight and go to a different time zone and then perform, that's exactly what we're doing. So, or shift work and many other situations where actually sleep is impaired because of the work we do. Not to mention all the people who are impacted by the fact that they're just not sleeping very well because they've got young children or noise going around the house, something like that.
Absolutely. I think shift work is, that's something we've covered on HSE Network numerous times. It's an area where people often find that they have instances where they are micro sleeping every now and then. They call it shift worker disorder. And that impacts on, not only their ability to sleep in their own personal well-being, but also their ability to perform safely at work as well. Absolutely. Does FreshTracks implement any sort of process around helping people with sleep at all that you're aware of?
We will have one-to-one conversations with people that are fairly sort of light touch around their sleep. So if somebody is struggling with sleep, we will have a chat with them, maybe more than one conversation. I think what we're quite clear about is that we're not qualified to cure insomnia, but there are a very limited number, but there are some well-known approaches which can lead to that. The predominant one is CBT for insomnia, which is a thinking technique which can help people in about 70% of cases overcome chronic insomnia. So these people who are not sleeping for entire nights, night after night, so they're in a particularly bad state. And CBT is highly, highly effective there, but it's also a very challenging approach. So we wouldn't want to get involved in that. But we're really happy to talk to people about how they're sleeping and how they're performing. There's something called the Epworth Sleepiness Test, which can be found online, but we can work through that with people, and that just helps people identify how tired they are. And I think while sleep is the headline, tiredness is perhaps a better thing to talk about, because some people will feel they're sleeping really well, but actually they're feeling really tired the next day. So they can't quite match up. Why am I feeling tired and wanting to snooze every afternoon? I'm struggling to get up in the morning, I'm going to bed really early. Well, then we get into the quality of sleep. And I think that's quite an interesting area to explore, is what is sleep? Shall I expand on that a bit now?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Dan.
So sleep is more than one thing. I think we tend to think of sleep as being a single activity, when in actual fact there's two types of sleep, and they're completely different in terms of what's going on within us physiologically, although they look the same. So I think of it like wasps and bees. They're very different creatures, although at first glance they look the same. And sleep is a bit like that. So we have REM sleep and non-REM sleep. REM sleep, REM is REM, stands for relative eye movement. And if you ever watched, maybe you've watched your partner sleep, but if you watch a dog sleep or an animal sleep, you sometimes see a flickering eye. And that's when we get into a state of sleep where our body is completely shut down and our brain is being rejuvenated. So in simple terms, that's when our brain sleeps and resets. So much like a computer rebooting, REM sleep is that phase of sleep. That's one phase of sleep. The other sleep is non-REM sleep, which is a successive series of depths of sleep where our body is rejuvenated. So we almost have a body sleep and a brain sleep. And as we go through the night, we go through a series of 90-minute cycles. And those 90-minute cycles start with us getting into a deeper and deeper sleep, the non-REM sleep. And then we enter REM sleep when our brain is almost to a point of wakefulness again. And then we go into the cycles again. So quite often people wake in the night, they're simply between cycles. They've been through a period of deep sleep, through REM sleep, and then their brain waves are changing and they get into this almost waking state. And then that leads to waking up, particularly if your bladder's full or there's some sort of disturbance, we might wake up. And we should just go back to sleep very easily. Sometimes we're not even aware we're awake, we just go into the next cycle. But of course, if we're anxious, then those thoughts seem to be magnified at night and we're more likely to wake up and find it hard to go back to sleep. But it's quite a comfort, I think, in some respects, understanding this 90-minute cycle. It's not exactly 90 minutes for everybody, but it's around about that. If you wake up, say you go to bed at 11 o'clock and you wake up at 12:30, then that's great. You've had a cycle, and you've had and that's a good thing to have had. if you tend to stay awake for half an hour, but then go back into a series of cycles, then you've probably had quite a good night's sleep, even though you feel you've been awake during the night. So the sleep cycles are really key, and the fact that we have REM and non-REM sleep, or brain sleep and body sleep.
Absolutely. And I suppose with the two different types of sleep, it really breaks it down into you can't just say, okay, I've got 6 hours sleep, or between 6 and 8 hours sleep, and that's enough. You need to get the right kind of sleep as well. And if just linking it back to maybe alcohol consumption, if I'm sort of correct, does alcohol prevent your ability to get into that sort of REM sleep?
Yeah, the idea of a nightcap is completely false. Alcohol does make us drowsy, so it leads to a drowsy state. But in terms of the quality of sleep, going through those cycles, thoroughly through them, and getting to the point where our brain is truly refreshed, that's impaired by taking alcohol before you sleep. So it also impacts the brain sleep. The REM sleep is where our learning is consolidated. So if you're studying, drinking before you go to sleep, it's going to impair the ability to remember that information. So alcohol is not to say you shouldn't drink alcohol, but if you're struggling to sleep, then using alcohol to aid sleep is actually having the opposite effect. So a few sober nights and a few other techniques, lifestyle techniques, will probably help to reach a point where sleep is improved without the alcohol.
Okay, brilliant stuff, Dan. I think we've covered some really important and useful areas there. I guess my last question is, do you have any sort of tips that our listeners could use to improve their sleep at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think routine is really important. Just like when you're trying to get a toddler to go to sleep and improve their nighttime sleep, then routine is important. Having that same bedtime, having the same way we might give a toddler a bath and a story before bed, it's kind of similar for us in that if we have a bath, then that means that our core temperature actually can cool down, and we sleep better when our core temperature drops by a degree or two. So something like having a bath will mean that although the bath is hot, our body will then try to dissipate heat to the outside of the body. Our core will cool down and we'll be better prepared for sleep. Additionally, with temperature, a cool room is really important because we feel heat more during the night. So if we're in a room that feels comfortable when we haven't got bedclothes on, so 19, 20 degrees, that's going to feel very, very hot for the night. We might be woken up by being too hot. So about 17, 18 degrees is a better room temperature. Having a routine, the same bedtime, going to bed at the same time every night, 7 nights a week is, again, this might sound a bit patronizing, but it's not for everybody, but if you're having trouble with sleep, it can really make a difference. So I now do go to bed at pretty much the same time every night. I'm an early riser. That's my rhythm, is to wake up early, but I'm pretty tired by 9, 10 o'clock, and so I go to bed then. And if I find reading personally before I go to bed really helps. A lot of people find that. Certainly avoiding stimulants is key. So not just alcohol, but coffee later in the day coffee has a 6-hour half-life. So if you have 2 cups of coffee at 12 o'clock, by 6 o'clock, it's as though you've got 1 cup of coffee in your system. And a lot of us will have more than one or 2 cups a day. So if they're in the morning, they've got more chance of not having an impact in the afternoon and certainly in the evening. But other stimulants, and I think one of the greatest threats to us at the moment is the stimulant of what's on our screens. To some degree, the screen itself, the blue light's a factor, but if we're watching the news or checking a Facebook feed, or worse, doing work emails, we're then putting our brain back into the daytime high level of alertness, and that will very likely have a problem in our sleep, because as we go through the cycles and we start to consolidate the memories that are built up during the day, some of those more concerning things will come to the front of mind. Now, that's fine if we stay asleep, but if they wake us up, they're spinning around. And I think we've all had that racing mind syndrome that we get, the early hours of the morning. And that's my understanding is that's what's keeping a lot of people awake at night. And during lockdown, apparently 50% of people claim they were sleeping less well. So that's pretty much something to do with the fact that we're using rooms in different ways. So the use of the bedroom is quite important. It should be a haven where we really just sleep, especially the bed itself. So working in bed, eating in bed means that we associate our bed with more than just sleep. And that may sound like, well, we're intelligent people, we'd have the sense to manage that. But if I was to show you a film now of a beautiful piece of food being cooked and prepared, the chances are your mouth would water, because our brain does associate things that are unrelated directly to us with our body. And that's exactly what happens with the way we use our bedroom. So if we use our bedroom for exercise or for work, we lose that association with being a haven. So it's very, very important, if we can, to have as a haven. So if people are working from their bedrooms now, as many of us are having to, then just make sure there's some separation. Put everything in a box at night, shut the lid of the box at a reasonable hour, 6, 7 o'clock, something like that, or earlier. And then work goes in the box and you open it up the next day. So there's some sort of physical disconnection with work and sleep. Monitoring light exposure is important. If we're surrounded by bright lights, that can disrupt our sleep. So having a dim environment really helps just to encourage melatonin to be produced, which is possibly why people are feeling more tired in the winter months than they do in the summer months. If people in the up in Alaska and North Norway, where it's 24-hour daylight, they claim it's very, very hard to sleep in the summer because there's so much daylight, very hard in winter, because darkness produces melatonin, which is our natural hormone, our natural sleep aid. During the day, it's good to get some exercise outside, to use daylight to keep us awake and to sort of give a clear indication of day and night. But during the evening, better to embrace the darker time and use that to help. It's good to aim to wake without an alarm as well. If you're having to use an alarm every day, and if it's hard to switch the alarm off and to use the alarm to wake up, then the chance are not getting quite enough sleep. And it may be that it's just interrupting that final sleep cycle. Of the 5 sleep cycles we might have in a night, 4 or 5 most of us have, those 90-minute cycles, the last one has the greatest chunk of REM sleep in it, so the greatest brain rejuvenation. So that's when we get it where our brain's being prepared to be more creative, more decisive, more intuitive, all of those things we rely on our brain to be in our work. If we interrupt REM sleep, we don't get good REM sleep, we're less agile in that space. So waking up naturally at the end of that fifth cycle, having had a good chunk of REM sleep, is going to be much better for us than interrupting it 15 to 30 minutes early with an alarm. So a great goal, if you want to really sleep at a high level, is to not wake up with an alarm and just wake up naturally.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, I think we've covered some real fantastic topics there. I'm sure lots of it's going to resonate with our viewers and listeners and readers all around the world. So thank you very much for joining us on the HSE Network podcast, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon.
Many thanks.